Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to give a talk here. This is a fantastic workshop and a fantastic venue. So yeah, today I'll be talking about frontiers of imaging and understanding 3D nanoscale magnetic structures. So when I think about magnetic nanostructures and trying to understand their behavior, I try to think of it in terms of how the energy landscape of these structures are and what governs this energy landscape. And so simplistically thinking, one of the energy terms is the exchange energy. It could be either a direct exchange or all kinds of other exchange energies that can dictate how the spins interact with each other. Second one is the magnetocrystalline anisotropy, and so that depends on the type of material that you have, the crystallographic phase, orientation, and so on and so forth. And so depending on that, there will be a preferred direction of magnetization for the material. And the third one is the shape anisotropy, which becomes a strongly dominant energy term at the nanostructure scale. For example, if you make the nanostructure small enough such that they are a single state, then if they are small enough, then they form a single domain state, such as the ones used in artificial spin ices, for example. Or you can have cylindrical nanowires where the shape then dictates what kind of magnetic textures that will have, and again in 3 dimensions. And then the image that you've already previously seen, where if you have these kind of helical structures, that gives another difference in the shape that will govern how the magnetic domains behave. And so basically in these magnetic structures, the domains are formed in order to minimize the total energy of these structures. And so when we move to 3 dimensions, that provides more opportunities where some of these provides more opportunities where these energy terms can compete with each other and can lead to more complex domain structures that can be stabilized. And so it becomes important to understand and correlate the structure and the magnetic behavior together in these kind of systems. And there are other energies which probably are not included here, but those are kind of the important ones. So we've already seen a lot of data being presented on Lorentz TEM for imaging skyrmions and stuff. So I'll give a very brief introduction of how Lorentz TEM works, what are the capabilities, and end with a sort of a cautionary tale about how to interpret the Lorentz TEM data. So in Lorentz TEM works basically similar to a standard transmission electron microscope, except that the sample sits in a field-free region, as opposed to a standard TEM where it's an immersion lens, so a sample experiences almost a 2 Tesla field. When we put the sample inside the microscope, when we are under in-focus condition, I don't know why it changed suddenly. When we are under in-focus condition, we basically get a uniform contrast, and the contrast is mainly dictated by electron scattering, as shown by the image here, which is basically just a uniform gray color, gray contrast. But when we go out of focus, either under focus or over focus, we see appearance of black and white strong contrast that reverses upon change of focusing condition. For example, if you look at this one particular domain, the white contrast that switches to black contrast when we switch the side of focus when we are imaging. And so these are regions where there is a change of magnetization, and that's what gets detected in Lorentz TEM. And so what that means, this could be related to domain walls, vortices, skyrmions, or all kinds of spin textures that are formed in these thin films. So we can not only get these kind of representative images of what domain walls and domain and spin textures are formed, but we can also go beyond. And this is one example which shows I don't know how good the contrast is, but it shows a series of images as we go through the focus change the focus. So in the in-focus condition, you will see some basically contrast from a polycrystalline grain. And as we start going out of focus, we see appearance of the skyrmions and skyrmions in this particular material, which is iron germanium telluride. And then we can correlate where these skyrmions are formed with respect to where the grain boundaries are, whether they are confined, they cross the grain boundaries, and so on and so forth. Then from these through focus series of images that we have recorded, we can actually get back and reconstruct the magnetic induction maps using the transport of intensity equation. So basically, the transport of intensity equation relates the through focus series to the phase shift of the electron wave, and the gradient of the phase shift, from the gradient of the phase shift, then you can map the local projected magnetic induction map, where the color then indicates which direction the magnetization is. And so this was part of the pandemic project for 2 of the graduate students in our group, where we developed this open source code base called PyLorentz, which basically can take input from any micromagnetic simulations such as μmax or oomph, and then we can set what the microscope parameters are. Similarly, what the sample parameters are, whether thickness, extinction distances, and whatnot, and then compute the phase shift of the electron. One of the development we did for this particular work was that we incorporated a new method for calculating electron phase shift, such that for more complex 3-dimensional magnetization maps, we can do that at any for any sample tilt direction. And then once we have the phase that is computed, then using the microscope transfer function, we can simulate the Lorentz TEM images or have the experimental Lorentz TEM images, and then we implemented the TIE technique to reconstruct the phase shift and the magnetic induction maps. Oops. So while we are doing this, this was kind of the cautionary tale that to talking about interpreting Lorentz TEM data. So just to give you a simple example of a near skyrmion, it has a 3D magnetic texture, and that's the image of what you would get in when you do μmax simulation. That looks nice. When we simulate the Lorentz TEM images, under 0 tilt conditions, we do not see any contrast in the image, and that's because of the divergent or the convergent nature of the spin texture. In order to see the magnetic contrast from these near type skyrmions, we have to tilt the sample. And so once we tilt the sample, we see additional contrast appear that shows where the skyrmion is present. And so when we tilt the sample, then this was just to kind of show how we can interpret the data. So that's the magnetization map of a tilted sample when it is projected. So just showing the projected magnetization map, from which we can compute the Lorentz TEM image that looks like what we are expecting. And then from that, using our formalism for reconstructing the magnetic induction map, we can reconstruct the magnetic induction map. And that's what that looks like. So now these two don't match each other at all. So if you're trying to interpret something about how the magnetization looks like just by looking at this, it's not trivial. And that's what it is basically, is that this one is the magnetization and the other one is the projected magnetic induction. So one has to be very careful in interpreting this data. For example, now if we actually consider the stray field and the DMAG field in the micromagnetic simulation, so not just the magnetization in the sample, the stray fields above and below, we can compute that, project that, and then actually calculate B, which is μ0 m plus h, and then that matches with what we get from experiments. And so the bottom line is basically in Lorentz TEM, we measure total projected magnetic induction map, which definitely includes contribution from stray fields. This is particularly important for materials such as which show near type skyrmions, which have strong perpendicular anisotropy because there are strong stray fields arising from that. And so then simulation becomes critical to account for the tilt as well as the stray fields, and then from that we can potentially think about interpreting what the contrast, what the magnetization in these images are. So since this was about 3D imaging, so this was vector field electron tomography now almost 10 years ago. This was my actually my PhD thesis work, where we developed electron tomography and combined it with phase reconstruction methods to reconstruct 3D magnetic fields. And so here this is just showing the, so we can construct either the vector potential or the magnetic induction maps in 3 dimensions. This was from an example of a patterned permalloy square. But then same approach was recently used by Daniel Wolf at Dresden to look at these three-dimensional reconstruction of skyrmion tubes. And one of the challenges with this is that the data acquisition and the experiment is tedious. You have to tilt the sample along two orthogonal tilt axes to get the data, since we are reconstructing a vector field. And at the end of the day, what we reconstruct is still the magnetic induction maps. In principle, from that you can try to isolate where the magnetization is, but what we are reconstructing is the magnetic induction maps in 3D. So the question is, can we directly reconstruct the sample magnetization from Lorentz TM data itself? The answer is machine learning and AI. As one of our organizers already showed, it's inevitable to use machine learning and in nowadays. And so now that we have a compact forward model that relates magnetization, from the magnetization, we can compute the phase shift. From the phase shift, we can compute the Lorentz TM images. And so we basically use a neural network as a iterative solver to go back to iteratively solve for magnetization from the images that, that can be calculated from that. So this is just this is an example. First, just for demonstration purpose, we started with just a simple 2D case. And so if you see, this is basically just one voxel deep, so it's just a two-dimensional magnetization map of a near-type skyrmion. And then we simulated images, and so we can't just use only single image. We need to have some, because of the data, the number of variables that we are trying to solve. But at least in this case, we started off with only 5 images. So the 0 tilt image and 2 images at plus and minus x tilt, and 2 images at plus and minus y tilt. And then we run the iterative solver. We start with a initial random magnetization guess, and then let the solver reach finite, where the losses become, when we are reached, when losses are no longer changing. And then by the end, we get what looks like the magnetization that we had initially started with. And so at the end, the final reconstructed magnetization maps beautifully with what we had started with from MuMax. And these are just, for comparison's sake, the images. So now, so in principle, this method works. Right now, obviously, this was only for a 2D image. So now the question is, can we extend this to 3 dimensions? Oh, one more point is, notoriously for near-type skyrmions, it is hard to determine chirality using Lorentz TM images, because the contrast does not arise from the texture of the spin texture of the skyrmion, but from the stray fields. And so it was a surprise to us that basically just by having these 5 images, there is enough information in that you can actually reconstruct the skyrmion chirality in this case, because we are actually reconstructing the magnetization map, not the magnetic induction. So moving on to 3 dimensions, we started with again like a simulation with near-type skyrmions, where particularly one that was slightly deformed in the simulations, and this is not on purpose. It was just a random simulation that we started off with, and it ended up relaxing into this state. And then this is what the magnetization looks like in the z direction. If we use the standard method of analyzing this data, we reconstruct the magnetic induction map. That's what this would look like. And then if you're trying to estimate that this deformed skyrmion, it's almost next to impossible to tell what kind of spin texture is happening there, because of what we are projecting is the magnetic induction map. And so that's where this method would shine. So in this case now, since we are actually also reconstructing along the depth of the thin film, we realize that we can't just start with, we can't only use 5 images. We need a little bit more data to start with. But that's not still as tedious as doing a full tomography series. We're starting with only 9 images at different tilt angles. So it's effectively like a conical tilt series. And then from that, again, using the same algorithm, we can reconstruct the magnetization map. And it actually reconstructs it quite nicely along the z direction as well, to the point where some of these, I don't know how clear it is, but some of these spins near the surface are curling away from, or parallel to the surface, and we can actually get that quite reproduce that quite nicely using this approach. And so that's kind of where we are right now, and now we are pushing this towards experimental data, and then we'll start working with, hopefully get some reconstructions from experimental data as well. So that was the part about generally talking about three-dimensional reconstruction methods. For the remaining talk, I will talk about our work on cobalt nanohelices. And so this was an example. What does that look like? Looks like the cobalt nanohelices, but they are not. This was interesting. This was actually an art installation at Art Institute of Chicago by an artist called Maren Hasinger. Interestingly, it was called "This is How We Grow." I thought it was interesting. And it basically shows some industrial rope that is curved pointing towards Lake Michigan. So I just thought it was cool. And you can see the projections of these. It can look nicely spiral. Then we already saw yesterday about how we can fabricate this. So we also use a FIBIT approach to grow these nanohelices. And one of the focus that we are trying to understand is understanding the effect of curvature and torsion in these nanohelices and how that affects the domain behavior in them. And so by varying the growth conditions, such as changing the dwell time or the acceleration voltage, which is basically changes the beam current in the electron beam, we can grow these nanohelices with different curvature and torsion. Basically, it's like having a spring and then either expanding it or compressing it. And then this previous work, we did tomographic reconstruction of structural tomographic reconstruction of these nanohelices and then computed the curvature as well as torsion. One of the issues with like just this approach is that basically for a nanohelix, for a given helical diameter, the curvature and torsion is fixed basically because it depends on the geometric parameter. So although we can vary, this varies across nanowires, not within a nanowire. So that was the idea, that can we change this? And so this is a work by John Fullerton, so if we compute the curvature in a nanohelix depends on the radius and c, which is related to the pitch of the nanohelix. And so if we vary the radius of the helix as it is growing, then we are also changing the curvature as it grows. So that's what is shown in these two nanohelices, where we are actually changing the radius of the helix as it is growing up. And so effectively, along the growth direction, we have a change of curvature and torsion within the same nanohelix. And again, so to understand whether it is actually that's the case, we did these were grown directly on TEM grids, and so we did tomographic reconstruction. And from that, we can map the Gaussian curvature as well as compute the helical curvature of these nanohelices. And that does show that as a function of height, we do have the overall magnitude of curvature does increase. So next, we wanted to look at what the magnetization state of these helices looks like. And so again, from the bright field images and recording through focus series, we can reconstruct the magnetic induction map. And instead of just comparing it with a simulated data of these nanohelices, John had a clever idea of, now that we actually have the tomographic reconstruction of these nanohelices, what he used is the 3D reconstruction of the actual helix that we have generated that was used as input for micromagnetic simulations. So now we are actually incorporating the physical deformations or changes that have happened in the structure into micromagnetics. And so then we can do this was the first time we did this. I don't know if this has been done before. But then we can do the simulations and reconstruct the magnetic magnetization, from which we can simulate the phase reconstruction and go through the process and then compare it with the experiments. There were no surprises here. Basically it formed a uniformly magnetized state because this was at the remnants that we were observing. But just kind of it gave a good starting point where we can now match actually incorporate the real structure of the nanohelix and compute the magnetization from that. So that's what this shows. We reconstructed the 3D microstructure. And since now we have the three-dimensional structure in μmax, we can simulate what the reversal would look like and whether the change in curvature along the nanohelix has any impact on the magnetization reversal. Due to experimental challenges, we couldn't do this yet experimentally. But at least in simulations now we can see that as the field is being increased, we see a formation of sort of like a vortex, domain vortex that is formed in there. And that stays pinned for a relatively larger field value as compared to the previous steps. And again, mapping this back with the structure that we have determined, this shows that this region seems to have a larger, not only a larger curvature, but also actually the diameter of the helix is no longer circular at that point because this is near the top. It becomes slightly elliptical. So it's basically a combination of those two that basically ends up pinning this domain wall that is formed. And so that we were able to correlate with the experimental geometry to try to understand how the magnetic behavior in these nanostructure occurs. And so this was a work with a single nanohelix, and so we did see that the curvature does affect pinning of domain wall, but it only appears under applied field or during reversal. Under remnant state, single domain state is preferred, and so it's kind of not as interesting as we would have thought. And so the next step we are doing is trying to create kind of these interconnected nanowires where we can now have design parameters of changing the curvature or the overlap between them, so we can have different regions of different spacing in between, and then look at how the magnetization of these structures will form, and then depending on, similar to the work that Dennis showed yesterday, where they have tetrapods. Effectively at these intersections now we have these kind of tetrapod features, but not just a simple tetrapod, there's also curvature associated with them because they are curved helices. So that's kind of the next steps where we are going, and then try to implement this with our machine learning methods to actually reconstruct the 3D magnetization. So with that, I'd like to thank all the work of the graduate students, Tim and Arthur. Arthur is now actually at LBNL, John, and all our collaborators, and our funding by Office of Science, Basic Energy Sciences, DOE. Thank you for listening. Happy to take any questions.